They say silence is a woman's loudest cry, but they are mistaken. Sometimes, silence isn't a cry for help. It is the calm before the storm, the quiet hum of a perfectly crafted engine of retribution. It is the space between a lightning flash and the thunderous roar that follows, a moment of pure, terrifying potential. In that space, entire worlds can be unmade and remade. In a glass-walled conference room, 40 stories above the ceaseless energy of Manhattan, time itself seemed to be holding its breath. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of steel and ambition, but inside the room, the air was thin and cold. Alara Vance sat perfectly still, her posture immaculate, her hands resting calmly in her lap. On the polished mahogany table between her and the two other occupants of the room lay a sheaf of papers. Their titles were stark and brutal against the crisp white paper: Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, and nestled beneath it an even greater betrayal: Stock Repurchase Agreement. Her husband, Liam Vance, the man whose dream she had built into an empire, refused to meet her eyes. He stared at a point just past her shoulder, a muscle twitching in his jaw. There was a faint sheen of sweat on his brow, a stark contrast to his expensive, perfectly tailored suit. He was trying to project power, but all Alara could see was the ghost of the insecure boy she had once loved, now drowning in an arrogance he wore like borrowed armor. Beside him, his mother, Beatrice Vance, was a statue of cold triumph. Her gaze was sharp and merciless, dissecting Alara with a disdain she had never bothered to conceal. For years, Beatrice had whispered the term gold digger like a prayer, a curse meant to poison every success Alara had earned. Today, in her eyes, that curse had finally borne fruit. She believed she was witnessing a final victory, the ousting of an unworthy usurper. The lawyer droned on, his voice a monotonous blend of legal jargon and veiled threats, but Alara heard none of it. She was listening to something else entirely. She was listening to the frantic beat of Liam's heart, the soft, satisfied exhale from Beatrice's lips, the subtle shift of paper as the lawyer pushed the agreement, and a pen closer to her side of the table. They expected tears, they expected hysterics, perhaps even begging. They had prepared for a storm of emotion. What they got instead was a profound, unnerving silence. A silence that was not empty, but full. It was full of memories, of late nights spent coding while Liam slept, of her own inheritance poured into a failing idea, of every sacrifice she had laid at the altar of his ambition. And now, in this sterile, silent room, those memories were not turning to ash. They were crystallizing into something hard and sharp and unbreakable. They looked at her and saw a victim. They had no idea they were looking at an architect, and she was already designing their ruin. Before the silence of the boardroom, there was the noise of a shared dream. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of clicking keyboards, the scratch of a stylus on a digital tablet, and whispered conversations that lasted long after the moon had claimed the New York sky. Before the chill of betrayal, there was the warmth of a cluttered queen's apartment, where two people believed they could build a universe out of nothing more than talent, love, and a staggering amount of instant coffee. To understand the cold precision of Alara's retribution, you must first understand the fiery passion of her creation. Alara Vance, born Alara Nowak, was a daughter of queens. Her world was not one of legacy names or inherited prestige. It was a world of walk-up apartments, the distant rumble of the 7 train, and the unwavering belief that intelligence and hard work were the only currencies that truly mattered. She was a prodigy hidden in plain sight, a girl who found more beauty in the elegant logic of a line of code than in any painting. While other kids were out playing, she was taking apart old radios to see how they worked, teaching herself programming languages from library books. Her mind was a fortress of strategy and logic, and it won her a full scholarship to Columbia University, a ticket to a world her parents could only dream of. She was on a path to a quiet, respectable life in academia, a future she had meticulously planned until a rainy Tuesday at a coffee shop called The Daily Grind upended everything. He was a fixture in the cafe where she worked part-time, Liam Vance. He had the tormented, magnetic air of an artist, with charcoal smudges often on his fingers, and a gaze that seemed to be looking at a world parallel to everyone else's. He came from a family that clung to the ghost of old money, a lineage Beatrice, his mother, polished like a tarnished silver trophy. The Vances had a name, but the fortune that built it was long gone, leaving behind only a suffocating sense of entitlement. Liam was talented, a brilliant graphic designer and conceptual artist, but he was adrift, his genius confined to the pages of a worn leather sketchbook. One afternoon, rushing to clear a table, Alara saw his sketchbook lying open. Her intention was simply to close it and set it aside, but the drawings held her captive. They weren't just sketches of people or landscapes. They were blueprints for new realities. User interfaces that floated in mid-air, immersive digital worlds with their own unique physics, designs that were decades ahead of their time. Most people saw doodles. Alara saw a revolution. She saw the architectural plans for the future of human interaction. That was their beginning. Their first real conversation wasn't about the weather or their majors. It was a fiery, passionate debate about the ethics of virtual reality and the potential of augmented experiences. He was the dreamer, the one who could imagine impossible things. She was the architect, the one who saw, with immediate and startling clarity, how to build them. He was captivated by the way her mind worked, the way she could take his most abstract idea and, in minutes, map out a logical path to its creation. She was captivated by the raw, untamed creativity that poured out of him. They fell in love not just with each other, but with the intoxicating potential of what they could create together. The birth of Vance Innovations didn't happen in an office. It happened at 2 a.m. in a greasy spoon diner on the back of a stack of paper napkins. Fueled by cheap coffee, Alara's hands flew, sketching out flowcharts, server architecture, and a multi-phase business plan. She laid out the entire foundation: the proprietary rendering engine, the target demographics, the monetization strategy. Liam watched, mesmerized, as she gave his art a vocabulary he never knew it could have. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his translator, his strategist, his partner, in the truest sense of the word. He would draw a fantasy world, and she would write the code that allowed you to walk within it. But every great story has its dragon, and their dragon was Beatrice Vance. The first time Liam brought Alara to the family's stuffy, rent-controlled apartment on the Upper East Side, the air crackled with disapproval. Beatrice surveyed Alara not as a potential daughter-in-law, but as an auditor examining a flawed account. She saw Alara's thrift store dress, heard the faint echo of Queens in her accent, and made her judgment instantly. In Beatrice's world, you were either born into the right family, or you were a predator circling those who were. It must be so, different, for you, Beatrice had said, a thin smile playing on her lips. To be around people like us. The Vance name still opens certain doors, you see. One must be careful who they let walk through them. The accusation was clear. Alara was a gold digger. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. She was digging, all right, but she wasn't looking for gold. She was laying the foundation for an empire, while Beatrice was merely squatting in the ruins of one. Liam, ever desperate for his mother's approval, offered only a weak defense, a timid clarification that Alara was brilliant. It was the first sign of a weakness Alara chose to ignore, a crack in the foundation she papered over with love and optimism. She believed her love could fortify him, that their success would prove his mother wrong. She didn't realize then that for people like Beatrice, the success of an outsider is not proof of their worth, but merely evidence of their cunning. And she certainly didn't realize that the man she loved would one day stand by and watch his mother hand her a pen to sign it all away. The decision to abandon her own future for the sake of his was not made in a moment of grand, dramatic sacrifice. It was made on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the university's administrative office. Alara stared at the PhD. Withdrawal form, its cold, bureaucratic language, a stark contrast to the vibrant, chaotic world of code and creation she now inhabited. Her supervising professor had been deeply disappointed, calling it a waste of a singular talent, but he saw only the world of academia, of peer-reviewed papers, and quiet prestige. He didn't see the universe she and Liam were building. With a steady hand, she signed her name, severing the final tie to her carefully planned life. The very next day, she walked into a bank and wired the entirety of her savings, along with a modest inheritance left to her by her grandmother, a woman who had spent 50 years working at a sewing machine so her granddaughter could have a better life, into a newly created business account. The name on the account was Vance Innovations. It was her past, her present, and her future, all condensed into a single wager on the man she loved. Their first headquarters was a cramped, second-floor apartment in a Brooklyn brownstone, a place that perpetually smelled of stale coffee, hot electronics, and takeout containers. Wires snaked across the floor like vines in a digital jungle. The walls were covered not with wallpaper, but with whiteboards, one half filled with Liam's spectacular, sprawling concept art, the other with Alara's elegant, terrifyingly complex algorithms. This was the crucible where their dream was forged. Their days were a blur, melting into one another without distinction. 18 hours was a short workday. Alara would code until the letters on her screen swam together, her mind a landscape of pure logic, building the digital engine that would power their revolution. Liam, in turn, breathed life into the machine, designing the breathtaking visuals and intuitive user experiences. He was the soul of the company, the artist in residence. But Alara was its heart, its brain, and its central nervous system, pumping the lifeblood of pure functionality through every digital vein. They were a perfect, symbiotic team, or so it seemed. The money from Alara's savings burned fast. They missed rent twice. They lived on ramen and hope. Their few initial pitches to investors were disastrous. Men in suits couldn't see past Liam's artistic temperament and Alara's quiet intensity. Just as their dream was about to flicker and die, Alara had her breakthrough. Working alone for 72 hours straight, she perfected the core of their technology, a piece of proprietary code she privately called the Atlas Engine. It was a marvel of optimization, an algorithm that allowed them to render hyper-realistic virtual environments with a fraction of the computing power their competitors needed. It wasn't just an improvement on existing technology. It was a quantum leap. This was their secret weapon, the key that would unlock everything. When she finally ran the first full simulation, Liam watched, speechless, as his most demanding, complex designs came to life on their prototype headset, running as smoothly as a film. He looked at her, his eyes wide with an awe and adoration that, for a fleeting moment, made every sacrifice worthwhile. The Atlas Engine changed everything. Their redesigned demo, now impossibly sleek and efficient, secured them a round of seed funding that felt, at the time, like all the money in the world. Their first product, a VR experience called Ethelberg, launched 6 months later. The market went wild. Tech blogs raved about its unprecedented performance. The money didn't just trickle in, it came in a tidal wave. Suddenly, they weren't two kids in a dusty apartment. They were the founders of the fastest-growing tech startup in New York. The move to a gleaming office in the Flatiron district was dizzying. They hired engineers, marketers, and designers, all of whom looked at Liam with a kind of hero worship. He was the visionary, the creative genius whose face was on the cover of tech magazines. He had a natural charisma in front of cameras, a way of speaking about their technology that made it sound like magic. And Alara, out of love and an innate aversion to the spotlight, was happy to let him have it. She preferred the quiet hum of the server room, the solvable problems of a clean line of code. It was during this heady ascent that Liam brought up the corporate structure. He did it gently, over a rare, expensive dinner meant to celebrate another milestone. He held her hand across the table, his expression earnest. "You are the genius here, Alara," he said, and she believed he meant it. "You are the foundation of all of this." But the investors? The board. They need a single, clear voice. A frontman, a CEO. He proposed that he take the title and a majority share of the voting stock, assuring her it was purely a formality for the sake of public perception. She, in turn, would be the chief technology officer, the undisputed queen of her technical domain, with a substantial, though smaller, share of the company. Alara agreed without a moment's hesitation. Why wouldn't she? The titles were meaningless words, the percentages just numbers on a page. They were partners. They were a team. This company was their child, born from her logic and his dreams. She thought she was being pragmatic, shoring up their shared future by playing the corporate game. She didn't realize she was signing a confession of her own irrelevance. She was formally handing him the keys to the kingdom she had built, trusting him completely with the lock. She took the title of CTO and retreated to her lab, the silent, brilliant brain of the operation, while Liam, the handsome, charismatic face, stepped into the sundae. She failed to see that in the world of men and money, the person who builds the throne is almost never the one who is remembered as royalty. Success is a strange and powerful solvent. It doesn't change who people are. It simply burns away the facade they present to the world, revealing the true character that was lying dormant underneath. For Liam Vance, the self-effacing artist was the facade. The arrogant, self-aggrandizing king was the reality, and with every new success, he shed his old skin, forgetting the woman who had taught him how to fly in his haste to claim the sky as his own. The first cracks in their foundation appeared not in the quiet intimacy of their home, but in the cold, sterile light of the new boardroom. They were discussing a bold, aggressive expansion into the European market. Liam, energized by a recent glowing profile in a business magazine, was painting a grand vision of global domination. Elara, as always, had done the work. She had analyzed the data, run the projections, and found a critical flaw, a potential server overload, and a security vulnerability in the proposed data localization plan. In the old days, in the Brooklyn apartment, he would have listened intently, trusting her analysis implicitly. But here, surrounded by slick, sycophantic board members, her caution was an inconvenience. There's a 97% probability of a system bottleneck within the first 6 months if we scale this aggressively, she stated calmly, pointing to a graph on the main screen. I've outlined a more staggered, secure rollout that mitigates the risk. Liam didn't even look at the data. He gave a paternalistic, dismissive chuckle. Elara, my love, he said, the term of endearment, now a weapon of condescension. We're not tinkering in a garage anymore. You can't let the technical weeds obscure the big picture. We need to think like visionaries, not mechanics. The room was silent. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, then quickly rearranged their expressions into ones of admiration for their bold CEO. Elara felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. It wasn't just the dismissal of her work. It was the public humiliation. He had reduced her from his partner, the architect of their entire technical infrastructure, to a mere mechanic, a cog in the machine of his grand vision. In that moment, she saw a stranger sitting in her husband's chair. The collaborative we that had built their world had been officially replaced by the imperial I. This new Liam was a creation fed by two powerful forces, the roar of public adoration and the incessant, poisonous whispers of his mother. Beatrice Vance had blossomed in the new climate of wealth. She moved into a penthouse apartment paid for by a consulting fee from the company and dedicated herself to the full-time job of being the mother of a genius. At their obligatory Sunday brunches, she would hold court, relentlessly polishing Liam's ego while subtly chipping away at Elara's position. That dress is very practical, dear, she might say to Elara, her eyes scanning over Elara's simple, elegant attire. Then, turning to Liam, she would gush, "Darling, I saw the article. They compared you to a modern-day Edison. They see it. Everyone sees it. A mind like yours cannot be tethered. It must soar." The message was always the same. Liam was a thoroughbred, and Elara was the plow horse that had gotten him out of the mud, a necessary tool whose purpose had now been served. Liam, who had spent a lifetime craving the approval his mother only gave conditionally, soaked it all in. He began attending charity galas, exclusive art auctions, and rooftop parties the glittering, superficial world Elara found exhausting. At first, she tried to accompany him, standing awkwardly by his side as he held court, but she soon realized she was merely a prop, a relic from his humble beginnings story. Increasingly, he went alone. "It's work, Elara," he'd say, straightening his tuxedo. "Networking. You wouldn't enjoy it." It was at one of these events that he met Chloe Davenport. Elara first saw her in the glossy pages of a society magazine, her arm linked through Liam's at a fundraiser for the Met. Chloe was the daughter of Marcus Davenport, a notoriously ruthless investor who had recently taken a seat on their board. She was everything Alara was not, and everything Beatrice had always wanted for her son. She was tall, impossibly chic, with a laugh that was both musical and cutting. She came from old money, moved through the world with an effortless sense of ownership, and looked at Liam with the kind of practiced, unwavering adoration that a fragile ego requires for survival. The night Alara finally met her in person, the air was thick with unspoken truths. It was a company party, and Chloe was there as Liam's personal guest. She drifted at his side, touching his arm lightly as she spoke, finishing his sentences, mirroring his every posture. She treated Alara with a cloying, saccharine kindness that was more insulting than open hostility. "It is such an honor to finally meet the woman behind the man," Chloe said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "It must be so wonderful to watch him achieve all this." The narrative was being rewritten before her very eyes. The whispers she had once ignored began to grow louder. She would walk past a conversation that would die abruptly. She would hear snippets from junior executives. "He's the visionary, she just handles the back end. I heard she was just a lucky girlfriend." Beatrice's original slur, gold digger, was back, but now it had a new, cruel twist. They were erasing her, painting her as a fortunate bystander to Liam's solitary genius. They were taking her past, the 18-hour days, the sacrificed PhD, the inheritance from her grandmother, and wiping it all clean. That night, Alara lay awake in the cavernous, empty space of their penthouse bed. The city lights glittered outside, a silent testament to the world she had built. Liam came in hours later, the scent of Chloe's expensive perfume clinging to his clothes like a second skin. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't have to. The crack in their foundation was no longer a crack. It was a chasm, and she was standing on one side, watching the man she loved drift further and further away on the other, becoming a stranger in a landscape she herself had created. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not come with a thunderous roar or a dramatic confession. It came silently, on a Tuesday night, delivered through the cold blue light of a laptop screen. Liam had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache after a long day of investor meetings. The sprawling penthouse was quiet, the only sound the distant, mournful cry of a siren weaving through the city below. Alara was working in her home office, trying to reconcile a discrepancy in their latest R&D budget. She needed a projection file she knew Liam kept on his personal laptop. It was a mundane, routine request, an act she had performed 1,000 times before. She felt no hesitation, no sense of transgression as she walked into their bedroom, retrieved his sleek silver laptop, and brought it back to her desk. She opened it, and his email client was still active. A new message had just arrived, sitting at the top of his inbox. The sender was Marcus Davenport. The subject line was chilling in its corporate banality. Phoenix, timeline and legal finalized. A flicker of something not yet suspicion, but a cold curiosity made her click. Her intention was simply to see if it was something she needed to be aware of. But the email was part of a longer thread, a conversation stretching back for weeks, and as her eyes scanned down the page, the floor seemed to fall away beneath her. The language was a brutal cocktail of legalese and personal contempt. Marcus Davenport wrote with the detached precision of a surgeon discussing an amputation. They were talking about her. Once the board officially tables the European expansion and she objects, we can invoke Clause 12b of the Founders' Agreement, citing obstructionism. The predetermined buyout price will be pennies on the dollar. Alara's breath caught in her throat. Clause 12b, a piece of boilerplate text she had barely registered when their first lawyer, a friend of Beatrice's, had drafted the documents all those years ago. It seemed so innocuous then. Now she saw it for what it was, a loaded gun planted in the very foundation of their company, and its barrel was now pressed firmly to her head. Her fingers, trembling slightly, scrolled upwards, chasing the conversation back to its source. She found attachments, financial models, legal opinions, and a project proposal titled Phoenix. She clicked it open. The words on the screen blurred, not from tears, but from a surge of incandescent rage. It was her project, her secret, personal project. A revolutionary concept for applying the Atlas engine to create hyper-realistic, AI-driven educational simulations. She had pitched the core idea to Liam 6 months prior, a passion project she thought they could develop on the side. He had dismissed it as a niche distraction, a pet project that would divert resources. Yet here it was, fully fleshed out with market projections and a launch strategy, presented as Liam's visionary next step for Vance Innovations. They weren't just planning to steal her company. They were planning to do it using the stolen jewels of her own mind, and they were timing her ousting to occur just weeks before Phoenix's launch would send the company's valuation into the stratosphere. They weren't just pushing her out, they were arranging it so they would profit most from her absence. Deeper and deeper she scrolled, back through the weeks of correspondence, and the professional betrayal gave way to a personal devastation so profound it was almost physical. She found the emails between Liam and his mother. Beatrice's words were pure venom, dripping with years of resentment. "She's always been a sentimental weight on you, my son. Cut it clean. Chloe and her family are our future now." And Liam's replies, that was what broke her. He wasn't a reluctant follower. He was an active, willing conspirator. He referred to Alara, his wife, his partner, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, as the legacy problem and a necessary short-term liability. He wrote of her with the cold indifference of a CEO discussing a redundant piece of software that needed to be decommissioned. He spoke of his future with Chloe not as a sordid affair, but as a strategic merger, a union that would solidify his position at the apex of the tech world. The person she loved did not exist. He had never existed. In his place was this hollow man, this construct of ambition and weakness, so easily manipulated by his mother's bitterness and the empty flattery of high society. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest that made it impossible to breathe. The grief was immense for the husband she had adored, for the partnership she had cherished, for the decade of her life she had poured into a beautiful, elaborate lie. For a long moment, she sat there, frozen in the silent, sterile glow of the screen. The storm of emotion inside her was cataclysmic, but it did not produce tears. Instead, the white-hot agony began to cool, to compress, to transmute. It was a terrifying, clarifying alchemy. The grief, the shock, the heartbreak, they were all fuel, and they were forging something new in the ruins of her heart. The soft, loving woman who had blindly trusted was burned away, and in her place, something else was beginning to form. Something cold and patient and razor-sharp. The confusion was gone. The hurt was still there, but it was no longer a weakness. It was a whetstone. She saw them all now with perfect, crystalline clarity. They were not her family, they were her enemies. And they had just shown her their entire battle plan. Her hands were steady now. With a calm, deliberate precision that frightened even herself, she pulled out her phone. She didn't make a sound. She photographed every email, every attachment, every damning word. She triple-checked that the images were clear, then uploaded them to a secure, encrypted cloud server she created on the spot, an address that existed nowhere else in the world. She logged out of his email, cleared the cache, and closed the laptop, placing it exactly where she had found it. She walked back to her desk, the movement fluid and controlled. The architect had seen the flawed blueprints of the conspiracy against her. Now she would design a new structure. A fortress, a labyrinth, a tomb. The war had been declared, and she had just received all the intelligence she would ever need to win it. The morning after is the quietest kind of battlefield. Alara woke up, and for a single, blissful second, the world was as it had been. Then, the memory of the emails, of the cold, clinical words, detailing the demolition of her life, rushed in and settled like a shard of ice in her chest. The first instinct, the human instinct, was to scream. To run into the bedroom, throw the laptop at the wall, and force the man sleeping there to face the shrapnel of his own treachery. But her mind, the architect, the strategist, had already worked through the night, running 1,000 simulations. An emotional outburst was precisely what they expected, It would be Exhibit A in their narrative of her instability, the perfect justification for the coup they were planning. A screaming woman is a hysteric. A crying woman is a victim. But a silent woman, a woman who does not react as you expect, is a terrifying unknown. And so, Alara made her first move in a war they didn't even know she was fighting. She chose to do nothing. She got out of bed, her movements fluid and deliberate. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, the familiar ritual a steadying anchor in the churning sea of her new reality. When Liam emerged, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, she handed him his favorite mug. "Good morning," she said. Her voice perfectly even, perhaps a little tired, but not accusatory. He looked at her, searching for something, a hint of the suspicion he must have felt brewing. He found nothing but the placid surface of a wife going about her day. His relief was palpable. This, she realized, was his greatest weakness. He was so consumed by his own narrative that he was incapable of imagining she might be writing a different one. The greatest performances are not given on a stage under the hot glare of spotlights. They are given in the quiet, domestic theater of survival. Alara Vance was now playing the role of a lifetime. She became a ghost in her own life, a master of the art of being underestimated. She played the part of a woman slowly succumbing to a quiet depression. Her normally vibrant contributions in meetings became muted. Her laughter, once a ready and genuine thing, became rare and fragile. When Liam would ask, with a feigned concern that turned her stomach, if she was all right, she would give him the answer he so desperately wanted to hear. "I don't know," she'd whisper, looking away. "I just feel distant, like you're a million miles away." This confession, so close to the truth yet a complete fabrication of its emotional intent, was a masterstroke. It fed his guilt just enough to make him careless, and it confirmed his script. The marriage was dying a natural death, and his actions were merely a sad, unfortunate necessity. He saw a wife fading away, not a warrior sharpening her blade. While her outward persona radiated defeat, her true self operated in the shadows with the cold precision of a saboteur. She became a spy in her own empire. Their arrogance was her greatest asset. In all their plotting, in all their meticulous planning to divest her of her shares and her legacy, they had forgotten one crucial detail. She had built the digital kingdom they now inhabited, and she still held all the keys. Her root-level system administrator privileges, granted in the early days and long forgotten by everyone but her, became her secret weapon. Late at night, long after the last employee had gone home, Alara would sit in her office, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows on the wall, and she would move. She wasn't just copying files. She was creating a perfect, undeniable, and cryptographically signed archive of her entire contribution to Vance Innovations. The initial code for the Atlas engine, with timestamps proving it was written on her personal machine months before the company was even incorporated. Her handwritten notebooks from the Brooklyn apartment, scanned in high resolution. Every email, every project file, every digital breadcrumb that proved she was not just a co-founder, but the primary architect. Then, she went further. She wrote a small, elegant script, a piece of invisible code that she embedded deep within the company's email server. It was her ghost in their machine, silently creating a secret, off-site log of every communication between Liam, Beatrice, and Marcus Davenport. She was no longer relying on accidental discoveries. She was building a real-time dossier of their conspiracy. Her second front was financial. She knew a legal battle was coming, and wars are won with resources. She contacted a lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Shaw, whose name she found through an old university contact. Shaw was not a flashy corporate lawyer from a big-name firm. She was a shark who specialized in intellectual property disputes, known for her discretion and her ruthlessness. They met in a nondescript coffee shop in a different borough. Alara laid out the initial evidence on the table. Rebecca's expression shifted from professional skepticism to wide-eyed shock, and then, finally, to a look of grim, predatory admiration. Under her guidance, Alara began to build her war chest. She sold off a portfolio of personal stocks she had invested in before meeting Liam. She liquidated bonds and other assets that were solely in her name, carefully untangling her finances from his. The money didn't go into a simple savings account. It was funneled through a series of complex transactions into a newly formed, anonymously held corporation in Delaware. She called it Athena Strategic Solutions. Her performance was flawless because it was fueled by a truth they could not comprehend. When she sat across from Beatrice at their next Sunday brunch and let her eyes well up with tears at a particularly cruel remark about her lack of social grace, Beatrice saw a broken spirit. The matriarch was so delighted by Ilara's apparent fragility that she became even more brazen, her conversations with Liam more careless. They thought they were watching a woman crumble. They had no idea they were witnessing the strategic retreat of a general, luring her enemy into overconfidence on a battlefield of her own choosing. One evening, after a particularly draining day of playing the victim, Ilara stood before the mirror in her bathroom. She looked at the reflection of the sad, tired woman with hollow eyes and, for a moment, almost believed the disguise herself. But then she let the mask fall. Her expression hardened, the exhaustion replaced by an arctic resolve. Her eyes, clear and focused, held a terrifying intensity. They thought they were pushing her off a cliff. They would learn, far too late, that they had only taught her she could fly. The cruelest prisons are not made of iron bars, but of whispered doubts. The most effective poison is not the one that stops the heart, but the one that makes the mind question its own reality. As Ilara's quiet withdrawal continued, Liam and Beatrice, blinded by their own arrogance, saw not the calm of a strategist, but the vacant stare of a victim. They believed their plan was working perfectly, that she was succumbing to the pressure of her failing marriage and a job that had become too big for her. And so, they decided to help her along. They began, with a horrifying and unified purpose, to dismantle her reality, brick by brick. They began the gaslighting storm. It started subtly, in the flow of work. During a presentation to the leadership team on user engagement metrics, Ilara presented a slide with data from the previous quarter. Liam, standing at the other end of the room, tilted his head with a look of practiced, compassionate concern. "Hold on, Ilara," he interjected, his voice soft. "I think you've pulled the wrong data set. Those numbers look like the projections for next quarter, not the actuals from the last. It's an easy mistake to make." The room went quiet. Ilara knew her data was correct. She had triple-checked it that morning. "No, Liam," she said, her voice steady. "This is the correct file." He sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound. "Honey, I looked at it myself this morning. You must be mistaken." "Don't worry about it," he said, turning to the team with a charming, apologetic smile. "She's been burning the candle at both ends. We'll circle back on this." He moved on, leaving Ilara standing in a pool of manufactured doubt. He had not only challenged her competence, but he had done so under the guise of protecting her, painting her as a fragile, overworked woman prone to error. Later that day, she saw the email he sent to the team. "My apologies for the data confusion earlier. I've attached the correct deck for your review." He had attached her original deck, unchanged. The lie was now the official record. The psychological warfare soon bled from the office into their home, the place that had once been her sanctuary. Objects began to migrate. Her keys, which she always left in a ceramic bowl by the door, would turn up in the pocket of a coat she hadn't worn in months. An important research journal she was reading would vanish from her nightstand and reappear a day later on a bookshelf in the guest room. Each time, Liam would be the one to find it, his expression a careful blend of relief and worry. "Here it is, Ilara." In the linen closet, he'd say, holding up a technical manual she'd been searching for. "You've been so forgetful lately. I'm getting worried about you. Maybe you should really think about taking some time off to clear your head." It was a constant, insidious assault. Even knowing it was a deliberate act, a part of her subconscious began to fray. The sheer effort of questioning everything, of retracing her own steps a dozen times to prove she wasn't losing her mind, was profoundly exhausting. Beatrice, meanwhile, took the campaign public, playing the part of the concerned mother-in-law to perfection. Her performance was aimed at the board and key personnel. Ilara walked past the executive dining room one afternoon and saw Beatrice having lunch with David Chen, the seasoned board member who had always been Ilara's quiet supporter. Beatrice was dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, her voice a pitch-perfect imitation of sorrow. "I'm just so terribly worried, David. Alara overheard her say. She locks herself away for hours. She's not eating. Liam says she barely speaks to him. She's become so fragile, so paranoid. We're all just trying to figure out how to best support her through this difficult phase. Beatrice was a master propagandist, laying the groundwork for Alara's eventual removal. She wasn't just assassinating Alara's character, she was preemptively framing a hostile takeover as a compassionate intervention. The pressure was immense. To live inside a lie, to have your own sanity used as a weapon against you, is a unique and brutal form of torture. There were moments, late at night, when the mask would slip and she would stare at her own reflection, a voice in her head whispering, "What if they're right? What if you are breaking?" But then, she would retreat to the one place where the truth was immutable, her secret server. She would open the folder she had labeled Project Nemesis, and the doubts would vanish, replaced by a cold, energizing fury. She would watch the video file from the meeting, her own calm, correct statement, followed by Liam's patronizing dismissal. She would read the transcript of Beatrice's concerned phone call with another board member, a call her embedded software had dutifully recorded and transcribed. Every lie, every piece of manipulation, was not just an attack, it was an exhibit. Their attempts to build a case against her were, in fact, building the very case that would destroy them. This knowledge was her shield. It allowed her to absorb their poison and metabolize it into fuel. Their cruelty did not weaken her resolve, it tempered it into something unbreakable. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in which Liam had accidentally deleted a critical project file from her workstation and then heroically found a corrupted version in the trash, she came home to an empty penthouse. He was out, likely with Chloe, celebrating another successful day of their campaign. Alara walked into their shared walk-in closet, a cavernous space filled with his meticulously organized, brutally expensive suits and shoes, all of it bought with the profits from her mind. She ran her hand over the fine wool of a tuxedo jacket. She felt no anger, no urge to destroy. Instead, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the chilling, confident smile of a grandmaster who sees the entire board and has just watched her opponent make a fatal, predictable move. They were trying to drive a woman mad. They had no idea they were simply arming a goddess of vengeance. In any war, victory is rarely achieved through direct assault alone. It requires the careful cultivation of alliances, the turning of the enemy's strength into a weakness, and the discovery of secrets that can shatter their morale from within. Alara knew that the mountain of evidence she was compiling, her Project Nemesis, was a powerful weapon, but a weapon is useless without a moment and a place to strike. Her solitary war of observation was over. It was time to recruit. Her first target was David Chen. He was old school, a self-made man who had built a formidable portfolio through shrewd, patient investment. He sat on the board of Vance Innovations, not because of social connections, but because he had been one of their earliest investors, one who had seen the promise in their technology long before the hype. More importantly, Alara had always sensed a deep well of integrity in him, and she had seen the flicker of skepticism in his eyes during Liam's more grandiose presentations. She remembered the sight of him with Beatrice, the performance of the grieving mother-in-law. David was a man who trusted data over drama, and Alara decided to give him a data set he couldn't ignore. She orchestrated a chance encounter at a small, independent bookstore in the West Village she knew he frequented. As he was browsing the history section, she approached him, feigning surprise. After a brief, pleasant exchange, her expression turned serious. "David," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I have some concerns about the company's financial health that I believe the board is not fully aware of. Could I have 15 minutes of your time, completely off the record?" His eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied her for a long moment. He saw none of the fragility Beatrice had described, only a focused intensity. He nodded slowly. "My club is 2 blocks from here. Meet me in the lobby in half an hour." The club was a bastion of old New York dark wood, worn leather, and the heavy silence of serious money. In a small, private study, Alara laid out her case. There was no emotion in her presentation, no mention of betrayal or heartbreak. She was Alara Vance, CTO, and her only concern was the fiduciary duty of the board. She handed him a slim folder. Inside were not emails about an affair, but spreadsheets. Financial reports Liam had massaged to hide extravagant, unjustifiable expenditures. Projections for a new line of luxury VR suites that were bleeding capital with no viable path to profitability. And finally, the internal workup for Project Phoenix. "This is Liam's passion project," she explained, her tone clinical. "He's diverting top-tier engineering talent and a massive, unallocated budget to it, and he's planning to announce it at the annual shareholder meeting. As CTO, I have never been asked to sign off on its technical feasibility. My teams have not been allowed to stress test the core assumptions. From a risk management perspective, this is corporate malpractice. He is betting the company on a product that has had zero internal oversight from the one person whose job it is to provide it." David Chen was silent as he read, his poker face betraying nothing. But Alara saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes lingered on the discrepancies in the budget. When he was done, he placed the papers back in the folder and looked at her, his gaze penetrating. "Beatrice told me you were having a difficult time, that you were unwell. Does this look unwell to you, David?" Alara asked quietly, gesturing to the meticulous, data-driven report. A long silence stretched between them. In that moment, the seed of doubt she intended to plant had found fertile ground. The discrepancy was not in her numbers. It was in the two versions of Alara Vance he had been presented with. The sharp, logical executive in front of him could not be reconciled with the hysterical, paranoid woman from Beatrice's story. "You've given me a great deal to consider, Alara," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "I conduct my own due diligence. I trust you'll be discreet." It wasn't a promise of allegiance, but it was enough. She had an ally, whether he knew it yet or not. With a powerful piece now in position on the corporate chessboard, Alara turned her attention to a ghost. The story of Liam's father, Arthur Vance, had always been a cornerstone of the family mythos. As Beatrice told it, he was a weak, feckless man who, after losing a small family inheritance, had abandoned his wife and young son in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Liam had been raised on this narrative of abandonment, and it had fueled both his insecurity and his desperate need to succeed. But the story had always felt wrong to Alara's analytical mind. It was too neat, too cinematic. It was a story designed to create a villain and a victim. Late at night, with her war chest from Athena Strategic Solutions, funding access to the most powerful private databases and search tools, Alara the CTO became Alara the forensic investigator. She bypassed simple public record searches, instead diving into deep archives, cross-referencing digitized court filings, old property deeds, and tax liens from 3 decades ago. The official story crumbled almost immediately. She found the divorce filing. It wasn't for abandonment. It was filed by Beatrice on grounds of irreconcilable differences. She found the deed to their old home, sold a year after the divorce, with Arthur Vance's signature relinquishing all proceeds to Beatrice. This wasn't a man who had vanished. This was a man who had been systematically and legally erased. The digital trail was cold, but not gone. She traced him through a series of old addresses, each one more modest than the last. Then, a registration for a small business loan in the late 90s. Finally, she found it. A simple, functional website for a business in a quiet, working-class town in the Hudson Valley. Vance Mechanics. Classic car restoration and repair. Her heart hammered in her chest. She did an image search and found a recent article from the local paper about a town festival. There, standing proudly next to a flawlessly restored 1,960 seconds Ford Mustang, was a man with grease on his hands and a gentle, unassuming smile. He had Liam's bone structure, but his eyes were different. They were kind, clear, and held none of the haunted arrogance she saw in his son. The caption read, "Local artisan Arthur Vance with his prize, winning restoration." Alara leaned back in her chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating her stunned face. He was alive. He was a craftsman, a builder. He hadn't died destitute. He hadn't abandoned anyone. Beatrice's entire story, the foundational trauma of Liam's life, was a lie. This changed the nature of the war entirely. This was no longer just about a company. This was about a life built on a lie, a son poisoned against a father he never knew. Ilara didn't just have a new piece of evidence. She had found the origin point of the entire tragedy, the secret that held the whole rotten structure of the Vance family together. And now, she was going to drive upstate and meet him. The drive upstate was a pilgrimage away from the present. With every mile that pulled her further from the oppressive steel and glass of Manhattan, the landscape softened into the rolling greens and rustic charm of the Hudson Valley. Ilara felt the tight coil of tension in her shoulders begin to unwind, replaced by a quiet, solemn focus. She was traveling back in time, seeking a truth not buried in a digital archive, but living and breathing in a quiet town where the past was not so easily paved over. Some secrets, she mused, are not protected by firewalls, but by the simple, powerful act of being forgotten. Vance Mechanics was not what she had expected. It wasn't a grimy, cluttered garage, but a clean, orderly workshop that felt more like an artist's studio. The air smelled of clean oil, warm metal, and something else: patience. Tools were arranged on the walls with surgical precision. On a central lift, the gleaming, skeletal frame of a 1,950 seconds Porsche was being painstakingly restored, its engine components laid out on a nearby bench like the pieces of a complex and beautiful puzzle. And in the middle of it all was Arthur Vance. He was wiping his hands on a clean rag, his movements economical and sure. He looked up as her car crunched on the gravel driveway, his expression neutral, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He was wary, as a man long accustomed to solitude often is. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a calm, low baritone. "Arthur Vance?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He nodded. "My name is Ilara Vance. I'm Liam's wife." The name hit him like a physical blow. A flicker of 100 emotions crossed his face in an instant: shock, pain, confusion, and a deep, weary resignation. The walls went up immediately. "If Beatrice sent you—" "She didn't," Ilara interjected quickly, holding up a hand. "She doesn't know I'm here. This has nothing to do with her. Not directly." She looked from him to the car on the lift. "This is incredible work. The precision, the attention to detail. It's the work of an architect, not just a mechanic." The compliment was genuine, and it landed. Arthur's posture softened almost imperceptibly. He saw that she wasn't just flattering him. She understood. "I build things," he said simply. "So do I," Ilara replied. "My medium is just different. I build systems out of code." She had found their common language. For the next 20 minutes, they didn't speak of family. They spoke of their craft. He showed her the custom-machined parts he had fabricated for the Porsche. She described the challenge of designing a self-optimizing code that could anticipate user demand. A fragile bridge of mutual respect was built between them, the quiet understanding that passes between two people who know the unique joy and frustration of creating something complex and functional out of nothing. Finally, seated on two stools near the workbench, Ilara gently guided the conversation. "Arthur, the reason I'm here is because the company Liam and I built, it's in trouble. And I believe the problem started a long, long time ago." She explained the situation with a calm, factual detachment, focusing first on the corporate conspiracy. She told him about the plot to oust her, to steal her shares, to erase her from the company's history. She spoke not as a wounded wife, but as a fellow builder whose life's work was being dismantled by thieves. Arthur listened, his expression growing more grim with every word. "That sounds like Beatrice," he said, his voice laced with a 30-year-old bitterness. "She always despised people who made things. She only ever respected people who had things." "It's more than that," Ilara said softly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim binder. Inside was a clean, printed copy of the core mathematical principles and foundational algorithms of the Atlas engine. "This is it," she said. "This is the blueprint for everything we've built. The source of our success. I wrote the final code, but the core concept." She pushed the binder across the workbench toward him. He picked it up, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of logical notation. He read the first page, then the second. A deep furrow formed on his brow. He stood up and walked over to a tall, metal filing cabinet in the corner of the workshop. After a moment of searching, he pulled out a dusty, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. He opened it, and Alara could see page after page of dense, handwritten equations and diagrams, remarkably similar to the ones in her binder. "My God," Arthur whispered, looking from his old notebook to her modern printout. His face was a mask of disbelief and a dawning, profound sorrow. "My perspective engine." He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient pain. It was a hobby, a dream. This was back in the early 80s, on the first personal computers. I was an engineer, fascinated by the challenge of rendering three-dimensional space efficiently. It was all theoretical. I filled dozens of notebooks. He paused, swallowing hard. Liam. He was a little boy, smart as a whip. He'd sit with me for hours while I worked on it. He was the only one who ever seemed to understand. I showed him everything. I shared all my notes with him. I thought he was proud of me. His story came tumbling out, the words heavy with the weight of decades of silence. He described how, after a bad investment cost him his job and their savings, Beatrice had turned on him. His theories were no longer the work of a brilliant mind, but the worthless scribbles of a failure. She taught Liam to see him not as a dreamer, but as a dead weight, a source of shame. She had not just driven him away, she had systematically poisoned his own son against him, rewriting history to cast herself as the noble, abandoned victim. The final, horrific piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Alara. Liam's success wasn't just built on her sacrifice, it was built on the stolen ghost of his father's dream. He had taken the intellectual legacy of the man he was taught to despise and, combining it with Alara's work, had claimed it all as his own solitary genius. It was a betrayal so layered, so profound, it almost defied comprehension. Arthur sank back onto the stool, the printout and his old notebook side by side on the bench, a testament to a crime 30 years in the making. The pain of being erased by his wife was an old scar, but the knowledge that his own son had plagiarized his soul and built an empire on it was a fresh, gaping wound. He looked at Alara, and in her quiet strength and righteous anger, he saw a chance not for revenge, but for something far more important: truth. "She told him I was worthless," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. "And he spent his whole life trying to prove he wasn't me, using the best part of what I ever was." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, his gaze clear and resolved. "What do you need me to do?" "The amateur attacks, the professional prepares. A meticulously laid trap, where the enemy walks willingly to their own doom, is infinitely more devastating than the most ferocious, head-on charge." In the quiet, decisive weeks that followed her meeting with Arthur, Alara Vance transformed from a woman gathering evidence into a grandmaster positioning her pieces for the final, elegant checkmate. The war would be fought on 3 fronts: legal, corporate, and psychological. And on every front, her opponents were being led, with their own arrogance as their guide, into a snare of their own making. The legal war room was the sharp, minimalist office of Rebecca Shaw. Here, the plan was honed into a weapon of surgical precision. The centerpiece of their strategy was Arthur. Rebecca had him walk through his entire history, every detail, every memory, which a court stenographer documented into a sworn, irrefutable affidavit. The emotional peak of the process was the moment he formally signed over the exclusive intellectual property rights of his perspective engine and all its derivatives to Alara's holding company, Athena Strategic Solutions. As his pen scratched across the paper, Arthur was not just signing a legal document. He was reclaiming a lifetime of stolen credit, giving a voice to a ghost. "This is the kill shot, Alara," Rebecca explained, her tone devoid of drama. "We are no longer just arguing about marital assets or a wrongful termination. We are now asserting that the foundational patent, the very DNA of Vance Innovations' core technology, is the exclusive property of Athena. Legally speaking, Vance Innovations is a tenant living in a house they don't own, and we are the rightful landlords, about to serve an eviction notice that will echo through the entire industry. In a secure digital vault, Rebecca's team assembled the payload. Lawsuits for corporate fraud, patent infringement, and a dozen other charges, all primed and ready to be filed electronically with the courts at the exact moment Ilara gave the word. While the legal storm gathered, David Chen began his quiet insurgency within the company walls. Playing the part of the cautious, elder statesman, he started to probe at the edges of Liam's authority. In a board meeting to approve the budget for what Liam had grandiloquently renamed Project Legacy, David raised his hand. "Liam, a remarkable vision," he said, his tone respectful. "But the burn rate here is staggering. For the sake of our own due diligence, the minutes should reflect that the board has requested the CTO's full technical and security audit of the project." Liam, irritated by the challenge to his authority, waved it away. "David, this is a top-down, CEO-led initiative. Ilara's department is focused on maintaining current systems. We need to move fast, not get bogged down in bureaucratic oversight." It was a fatal mistake. Liam's arrogant dismissal was now officially recorded in the board meeting minutes, clear evidence that he was intentionally circumventing the company's chief technology officer on the most important project in its history. David then used this recklessness as leverage in quiet phone calls to a handful of other long-term, no-nonsense shareholders, men and women who, like him, were becoming increasingly wary of Liam's celebrity CEO persona. He didn't reveal the whole plan, but simply stoked the embers of their concern, ensuring that when the time came, he would have a small but solid block of votes at his back. The chosen battlefield was the annual shareholders' meeting. It was Liam's idea, the perfect stage for his coronation. He envisioned a grand theatrical event where he would unveil Project Legacy to a thunderous ovation and, as a sad but necessary piece of housekeeping, formally accept the board's vote to remove his struggling wife. It was to be his ultimate triumph, the moment he would shed the last remnant of his past and ascend to the pantheon of tech gods. They let him plan his party, completely unaware that Ilara and her team were designing the funeral. Ilara's performance in these final days was her masterpiece. She was the picture of tragic resignation. She was seen packing personal items from her office. She had a final, tearful meeting with Liam in which she seemed to beg him to reconsider, an act that inflated his ego to monumental proportions. He saw a broken woman surrendering to the inevitable. He never once considered that a retreat could be a strategic maneuver. He was so busy watching her fall that he never thought to look at the ground beneath his own feet. Behind the mask of defeat, the real work was being done. The counterattack was prepared not in a sterile office, but in the quiet, focused sanctuary of Arthur's workshop. It was a symbolic choice. They were two builders, preparing to reclaim their work from a salesman. They storyboarded their presentation, a devastating narrative that would unspool in front of the world. They synchronized their evidence. Arthur's 30-year-old notebooks laid beside Ilara's time, stamped code from the Brooklyn apartment, Liam's self-incriminating emails, the audio recording of Beatrice's conversation with David Chen, the damning minutes from the last board meeting. It was a story told in data, in sound, in images, a mosaic of deceit so clear and undeniable that it would require no embellishment. On the eve of the meeting, every piece was in place. Rebecca Shaw had a team of paralegals ready to file the lawsuits at her signal. David Chen had confirmed the proxies from his allied shareholders. Arthur had flown into the city, staying in a hotel under an assumed name. And Ilara, sitting in the living room of the cold, opulent penthouse, reviewed the final presentation on a tablet. The file was named, with a touch of grim poetry, "The Architect's Reply." She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering expanse of New York City, the same view she had from the boardroom where her life had been so casually torn apart. The view had not changed, but she had. She was no longer looking at a world that had been taken from her. She was looking at a city that was about to witness a queen, long thought to be in exile, return to her throne. The trap was set. The bait had been consumed. And Liam Vance was about to walk onto a stage he believed he had built, to celebrate a legacy he thought was his, utterly oblivious to the fact that the floor was about to drop out from under his entire world. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Midtown was electric, a secular cathedral consecrated to the gods of technology and capital. Tech journalists live-streamed from every corner, investors whispered in huddled groups, and employees of Vance Innovations looked on with a cult-like reverence. This was not merely a shareholders' meeting, it was a coronation. And at its center was Liam Vance, gliding through the crowd like a king, bathed in the warm glow of camera flashes and adulation. In the front row, a single island of stillness in a sea of motion, sat Ilara. She was pale, dressed in a simple, dark dress, her hands resting in her lap. To the casual observer, she was the picture of quiet defeat. Beside her, Beatrice Vance practically vibrated with triumph, her smile a slash of victory in her perfectly made-up face. She was watching the final, satisfying act of a drama she believed she had written. When Liam took the stage, the applause was deafening. He was a master performer, pacing the stage with a wireless microphone, his voice a perfectly modulated blend of passion and authority. He spoke of the future, of new realities, of a world remade in their image. Then he unveiled Project Legacy. The presentation was dazzling, a symphony of stunning graphics and ambitious promises. It was the future, and he was its sole prophet. To seize that future, he declared, his voice dropping to a serious, intimate tone, we cannot be afraid to evolve. We must be willing to shed the parts of our past that hold us back, to move beyond the cautious, earthbound voices that tell us it's not possible. The subtext was clear to everyone in the room. He was speaking of her. He spoke of the need for a realigned and unified board, ready to take the bold risks necessary for greatness. He finished to a standing ovation, his arms outstretched, accepting the worship. As the applause died down, the chairman of the board, a portly man completely under Liam's spell, stepped to the podium. Thank you, Liam, for that inspiring vision. We now move to the first item on the agenda, a procedural vote too. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. The voice, calm, clear, and amplified by a lawyer's natural projection, cut through the room like a shard of glass. It was Rebecca Shaw, standing near the front, her expression unreadable. A ripple of confusion went through the auditorium. Cameras swiveled to find her. Liam, caught completely off guard, stared from the stage, his triumphant smile faltering. Miss Shaw, this is a shareholders' meeting, not a courtroom, the chairman blustered. It is about to be, unless you recognize that there is a matter of profound material importance that directly impacts this vote and the entire future of this company, Rebecca replied, her voice unwavering. Information that has been deliberately withheld from the shareholders. I believe the company's founder and chief technology officer, Ilara Vance, would like to address you. A collective gasp went through the room. Before the chairman could object, Ilara stood up. In the dead silence, the sound of her heels clicking on the floor as she walked towards the stage was the only sound. She moved with a serene, unshakable purpose. She didn't storm the stage, she ascended it. An AV technician, acting on a pre-arranged signal, handed her a microphone. She walked to the center of the stage, standing a few feet from her husband. Liam looked at her, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. Ilara looked out at the silent, staring crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a victim. It was the calm, measured voice of an architect. Before you vote on my legacy, she began, her eyes locking onto Liam's, the word legacy hanging in the air between them. You all deserve to know the true foundation upon which this company was built. She nodded to the AV booth. The massive screen behind Liam, which moments before had been showing his face, flickered and changed. An image appeared. Their old, cramped Brooklyn apartment. This was the first headquarters of Vance Innovations, she said. Another image? A scanned copy of a bank transfer from her personal savings. And this was its first seed money. An inheritance from my grandmother. She was rewriting the story, reclaiming her history, piece by piece. Then came the kill shot. The screen split into two columns. On the left, pages of code from a file labeled Atlas Engine Alpha V0. 1, with timestamps from 2015. On the right, the core rendering code from Project Legacy. Lines of code, hundreds of them, began to glow, highlighted in crimson, showing a near-perfect one-to-one match. A low murmur went through the audience, a sound of dawning comprehension from the engineers present. It was not inspiration, it was plagiarism. The screen changed again, an email from Liam to Beatrice. His words, "unnecessary short-term liability," were magnified to fill the 50-foot screen. The auditorium was utterly silent, save for the furious clicking of 100 keyboards. Then, a sound file played. Beatrice's cultured, venomous voice filled the ballroom, a recording of her call to David Chen, so fragile, so paranoid. We're all just trying to support her. Liam was ashen, his body rigid. He looked out at the crowd, at the board members, at the investors, and saw only cold, accusing eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. Beatrice had risen slightly from her chair, her face a grotesque mask of rage and horror. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. The final slide appeared. It was a copy of the official board minutes, with the paragraph highlighted where Liam had dismissed the need for a CTO audit of Project Legacy, claiming he was leading it himself. It was the corporate nail in his coffin, proof of his deliberate deception of his own board. Alara let the image hang there for a long moment. She turned her head and looked directly at the shattered man standing beside her. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the room. The evidence you see here is just a summary. A complete and much more detailed dossier is being delivered to the board's legal counsel and the SEC as we speak. My lawyers will be filing their official complaint within the hour. She turned back to the audience. Now, she said, her voice clear and cold, by all means, you can vote. The silence that followed was the sound of an empire turning to dust. The silence that followed Alara's final word was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that fell over the entire ballroom. It was the sound of 1,000 people simultaneously processing the public execution of a king. The spell of Liam Vance was broken, his charisma revealed as a cheap veneer, his empire as a house of cards. Journalists typed with a manic intensity, broadcasting the corporate implosion to the world in real time. Investors stared at Liam, their faces masks of cold fury, the adoration of moments before curdled into contempt. Liam stood frozen on the stage, a statue of a man, his face the color of ash. The words on the screen behind him, his own words, were his public epitaph. He looked at Alara, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as his wife, not as his partner, not as the soft, forgiving woman he had decided to discard, but as this terrifyingly calm, impossibly brilliant stranger who had orchestrated his downfall with the precision of a master strategist. The chairman of the board, stammering and sweating, tried to regain control, but David Chen was already on his feet. "Mr. Chairman," David's voice boomed with renewed authority. "In light of this staggering evidence of fraud and malfeasance, I call for an immediate board vote of no confidence in CEO Liam Vance and demand his immediate resignation." A chorus of eyes echoed from the other board members. Beatrice, from her seat, finally found her voice, a strangled, venomous shriek. "Lies, she's a liar. She's trying to—" "It is all true." The voice came from the stage, but it wasn't Alara's. It was Liam's. The words were a hollow, defeated whisper, the last gasp of a man who knew the game was over. All the fight went out of him, and he seemed to shrink before their very eyes. But Alara was not finished. She took the microphone one last time. "The vote is a formality," she said, her voice cutting through the rising chaos. "Due to the pending lawsuit from Athena Strategic Solutions, the rightful owner of our core intellectual property, Vance Innovations, is, for all intents and purposes, insolvent." However, she paused, letting the weight of that word settle. "I have a recovery plan, a plan to rebuild this company on a foundation of truth, not theft. To do that, we need a leader who understands the very soul of our technology. To oversee our technical restructuring, to guide the true legacy of this company, I would like to introduce my new partner." All eyes followed her gesture toward the side of the stage. A door opened, and a man walked out. He was not a polished executive in a suit. He was a man in his late 60s, dressed in simple, clean clothes, his hands showing the calluses of a lifetime of honest work. He walked with a quiet dignity, his kind, intelligent eyes scanning the shocked faces in the crowd. It was Arthur Vance. If the room had been silent before, it was now a vacuum. Beatrice made a sound, a choked, guttural noise of pure, primal horror, as if she had just seen a ghost walk out of his grave and into her worst nightmare. Liam's head snapped up, his eyes, wide with disbelief, fixed on the man. The last vestiges of his composure shattered, and a single, broken word fell from his lips, a child's whisper in a storm. "Dad?" Arthur didn't look at Beatrice. He looked only at his son, his expression not one of anger, but of a vast, bottomless sorrow. And in that look, Liam Vance was completely and irrevocably broken. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Liam and Beatrice were voted out unanimously, stripped of their positions and their power. They were escorted from the ballroom, not by security, but by the crushing weight of their own public disgrace. The ensuing lawsuits filed by Athena Strategic Solutions and the board would systematically strip them of every cent they had gained from their fraud, leaving them with nothing but the tarnished Vance name Beatrice had worshipped and Liam had desecrated. In the weeks that followed, the company was reborn. Under the joint leadership of Alara as CEO and Arthur Vance as the new Chief Technology Officer, it was rebranded as Phoenix Innovations. The name was a promise. They went back to basics, focusing on innovation, not hype. They rebuilt the trust of their employees in the market, not with charisma, but with competence. The partnership between Alara, the brilliant strategist, and Arthur, the quiet foundational genius, became the new, unshakable core of the company. Months later, Alara stood in her new office, the same corner office with the same panoramic view of Manhattan. The city was unchanged, but her world was entirely new. She felt no giddy triumph, no bitter satisfaction. She simply felt a sense of profound, quiet peace, a sense of order, restored. Her fight had not been for revenge. It had been for the truth that builders are more important than showmen. The truth that a legacy is something you earn, not something you steal. Don't ever mistake silence for ignorance, calmness for acceptance, or kindness for weakness. Sometimes, the quietest people are simply listening, observing, and processing. They are the architects, designing their response with a patience that the loud and the arrogant can never comprehend. And when that response finally comes, it is not a storm of passion. It is the calm, clean, and devastatingly precise execution of a perfectly drawn blueprint. There are countless stories of betrayal hidden in the silence of families waiting for their moment. Join us next time as we uncover another.